5-minute warning or anything, or are you
Perfectly
well timed?
Well, maybe not perfectly well timed, but we'll see. If you do want to give me a wave when you want me to try and start
Okay,
wrapping up, I
Are
can.
you thinking 45, 50 minutes?
45, 50,
Yeah. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you again this morning, and welcome to any of you who weren't here yesterday. I'm Professor Ester McIntosh, the Associate Head for Programmes in Religion, Politics and International Relations here at York St John. It's my great pleasure this morning to welcome Dr. Jenny Mathers, who's going to speak to us on Russia's war in Ukraine, insights from feminist security studies. Jenny's a senior lecturer and the former head of the Department of International Relations at Aberystwyth University. She was in fact the first woman to be head of that department. She holds degrees from Mount Holyoke College, is that how you say that one?
Yep.
And from Oxford University. Her research and teaching expertise spans area studies, specifically Russia and Ukraine, so very topical just now, gender studies and security studies, as well as international relations. Her recent publications include Women, War and Austerity, IFIs, and the Construction of Gendered Economic Insecurities in Ukraine, and that's in the Review of International Political Economy. Medals and American Heroic Military Masculinity after 9/11, and that's in the edited collection Heroism and Global Politics, and Jenny is one of the editors of that collection. And a fantastic title, Even the Toys Are Demanding Free Elections, Humour and the Politics of Creative Protest in Russia, and that's in Cultural Forms of Protest in Russia, an edited collection with Alexander Etkin. She's currently writing a book that examines the ongoing crisis in Ukraine from a feminist security studies perspective. Jenny, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers for inviting me, including Ken and, of course, Isla, who has been doing a lot of work on this conference, I know. Thanks very much for inviting me to talk to you and share some of my thoughts about Russia's war in Ukraine from a feminist security studies perspective. I've got a long-standing interest in Russia. It was sparked when I was a high school student during the Cold War, and I had to take a compulsory course called Americanism versus Communism, which was designed to inculcate young Americans into the evil ways of communist Soviet Union and China. And rather than having the intended effect, it actually sparked a lifelong curiosity in me about the Soviet Union and Russia, which has certainly continued. I also have a long-standing interest in feminism, but more in terms of activism and a trigger for political change rather than as a source of analysis for security. But that changed in the mid-1990s when I was going back and forth to Russia on a regular basis. And I noticed that all of the border guards at the airport in Moscow changed from being all men to being all women. That made me wonder what was going on. And it took me down a path of investigating women soldiers in Russia, which took me down a path of investigating women in war, gender and conflict, and finally feminist approaches to security. I really appreciate that I'm part of a wider community of scholars from all over the world who are interested in Russia and who come together to compare opinions. Over the years, this has mainly been done through conferences and through reading each other's work, but increasingly it's been online, both through social media and of course, during the pandemic, through various webinars and online conferences. There's a really significant community of scholars, academics and analysts outside universities who work on Russia and who are on Twitter. And so if any of you are not on Twitter and you're interested in learning more about Russia and the war in Ukraine from social media, I think there's a lot of people there that you could usefully follow. A lot of us use Twitter to test out our ideas, present our analysis, share materials, share evidence, and try and figure out what on earth is going on. And this community has been particularly valuable to me since late last year, when Russia's military buildup on the borders of Ukraine began in earnest. And of course, since the mass invasion started on the 24th of February. Since the Maidan protest of 2013-14, I've also been increasingly looking for more and more Ukrainian scholars and activists and journalists to follow on Twitter and to read their work, as I've been really fascinated by the changes that Ukraine has been going through, its developing political transformation, and what that has meant for Russia's relationship with Kyiv. And of course, as I look for work on gender on this area and look for what women are doing in all of its process. Putin's disastrous war in Ukraine has commanded the attention of, it seems, the whole world. And at times during the past 5 months, it has seemed like the whole world has been asking me for my opinion about it too. Like most other people I know who work on Russia, I've done a lot of work with the media since the winter. I haven't counted up my media appearances recently, but I know I passed the 100 mark a while ago. Probably the most surreal experience doing media work about this topic was when I went to the International Studies Association earlier this year in Nashville, Tennessee, and I was contacted by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation to do an interview with them. They wanted to speak to me at 6 a.m., which is fine, I get up early, that's no problem. But I had a real hard time finding a quiet place to do the interview. I didn't want to do it in my hotel room because I knew people would be sleeping around me. And all throughout the main part of the hotel, they piped country and Western music 24 hours a day. But I didn't really want that in the background either. So I ended up going outside into a little courtyard with a swimming pool. And so I stood there watching 2 ducks have an early morning swim, listening to the dawn chorus and talking to Canadian Broadcasting about the war in Ukraine, which was definitely surreal. I've also been doing a lot of work with government. I've been involved in various discussions with the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office. And all of these interviews and discussions have really helped me a lot in developing my thoughts, and preparing for today's talk has helped as well. So thank you again to the organizers for this opportunity. Let's see whether I can move forward. Maybe, there we go. So I'm going to start with a quote from Ken, partly because he's here, and because I think Ken's engagement with gender and feminism isn't given as much attention as it deserves to be. But also because I think this quote really sums up well and very efficiently why we need to pay attention to gender in our analysis of IR and security. This notion that we would only be accounting for the surface reflections if we don't pay attention to gender, because that is helping us understand what's going on deep below the surface. I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. The recognition that gender is important in shaping the practice of international relations, as well as the discipline of IR, has been growing among scholars of IR since the late 1980s, for sure, when you had the first workshops and the first conferences and the first publications began to appear. And I think it's fair to say, though, that the acceptance of gender and feminist analysis of IR and security in the discipline is still patchy. I think a lot of feminist scholars still feel very much on the margins of a discipline. And certainly when I go to, and this has been true for many years, when I go to BISA or ISA conferences, and I go to the feminist or gender panels, you usually see other feminist scholars there rather than seeing more of a mix of people. And I notice the difference because I sort of split my time at these conferences between the feminist panels and the Russia panels. And of course, the Russia panels, and not just this year, but years gone by, tend to attract a wider group from among the conference participants beyond just the Russian studies people. However, there is a really thriving area of feminist analysis of IR and security. And there's an impressive generation of PhD students, early career scholars, and mid-career scholars who are doing some amazing research. And I would just mention one example in particular. Dr. Claire Wenham, who's at the London School of Economics, did her PhD in Aberystwyth. She's recently published a book called Feminist Global Health Security with Oxford University Press. And if you want a good example of how to apply feminist security studies approaches to a topic where it doesn't often get thought about, that's a really good place to look, a good place to begin. So more or less what I'm hoping to do today is to first say a little bit about what feminist security studies is. Then the bulk of my time I'm going to devote to talking about Russia and looking for the women and the work that gender is doing in Russia's prosecution of this war in Ukraine. And then I'm going to finish by focusing on Ukraine and the work that gender is doing in the way that it is presenting this war, not only to its own people, but also to outsiders. I'm going to spend more time on Russia than Ukraine, but I'm happy to take questions on Ukraine as I have a lot more to say than I'm going to have time to say. So let me move on to this. So sort of principles around feminist security studies, in case you're not familiar with it, to give you a sense of what this thing is all about. And I mean, one of the questions that some of the more sort of, I don't know, mainstream or traditional scholars of IR have sometimes asked feminist scholars is, what is your methodology? How do we know that this is feminist work? And the answer has been that feminist work uses a wide variety of methodologies. There isn't a single methodology. What distinguishes it most is that it asks feminist questions. It asks questions about women, but it also asks questions about gender. It asks questions about marginalized peoples, about intersectionality, and so on. So it's the questions really that drive and determine the nature of a feminist research project rather than methodologies in particular. We often start, and I will start my analysis today with Cynthia Enlow's famous question, where are the women? Because that tells us a lot. When we start asking that question, it uncovers a lot of things. But the feminist security studies goes further. It puts gender very much at the center of analysis. It does a lot of work recognizing what masculinities and femininities do in shaping security and insecurity, both the way that we think about it and also the way that it affects us in the material world. So there's both a discursive element and also a more material dimension to the research and the analysis. It's very much concerned with the experiences, the lived experiences of women and with the perspectives of people who are marginalized, including but not exclusively women. It does not assume that security is something that only happens at the high level of diplomacy and presidents and parliaments and so on, but it really is looking for and finding gendered sources of security and insecurity in everyday life. And again, I think this is something that you're going to see in what I talk about shortly. It also doesn't assume that practices or policies that make states or governments more secure makes people more secure as well. So I'm going to start with a very famous, well, one of two very famous meetings that happened back in February in Moscow. The more famous one perhaps is not the one that's depicted on the picture, but one where Putin met with his National Security Council, and he required each of them to stand up separately and to explain why they proposed or they supported his proposal to recognize the independence of the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbass. This was the sort of the precursor to the actual invasion. But a few days later, Putin had another meeting in the same room with a group of people. He met with the oligarchs. And I was watching all of this happening on Twitter as a journalist, a Russian journalist named Alexei Kovalyov was live tweeting it. Alexei is a journalist with the publication called Meduza, which, if you're interested in following independent Russian journalism, Meduza, M-E-D-U-Z-A, is a good one to follow, because they're now based almost entirely, well, they're mainly based outside Russia. They still have some journalists inside Russia, but they do a lot of deep dives into what's happening within Russian society and politics. And they're breaking lots of really, really interesting stories other people can get to. So I definitely recommend Meduza. Alexei is somebody who I've had as a guest speaker to speak to students about what it's like to be an independent journalist in Russia. And so at the time of the invasion, he was still in Russia, although a few days later, he left and he now lives in Estonia. Anyway, so I was watching Alexei do all this tweeting, and he was tweeting screenshot after screenshot of disgruntled looking oligarchs sitting in this meeting, listening to Putin, telling them basically that their fortunes were gone and their futures were pretty dire. And I noticed that one after the other of these pictures was men. And so I tweeted back to Alexei and I said, are there any women in this room? And this was what he tweeted in response, with a big arrow drawn to the one woman. Of course, she's not one of the oligarchs. She is there as part of the camera crew who's recording and reporting on this momentous event for posterity. So basically, what it brought home to me was that there's not a single woman in the whole of Russia who has enough money and power to qualify to be invited to sit in one of those chairs and listen to Putin talk about the significance of the war to come and economic sanctions, right? Now, this is not the part of security policy I'm going to start with, but I think it really made me think, okay, this is something that we take for granted, the male domination of Russian security policy and policymakers. This is just part of the world that we accept. It's one of the ways that gender is kind of hidden or hides, how it works by appearing normal and natural. Yes, of course, Russian security policymakers are men. What do we expect, right? but it really made me think, okay, we need to go back to basics. So what I want to do is start by talking about where are the women? Are there any women? There are two in the leading institutions of Russian security. Now, these are institutions that are represented on the Security Council, and they're also institutions that are really important in this particular war. There are other security-related institutions like the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Finance, which are also important for other kinds of security, but I'm really focusing on the ones most relevant to the war. So I'm going to focus on these to begin with. Security Council has 30 members, one of whom is a woman. Now, the woman who is on the Security Council is there by virtue of the fact that she is the head of the Russian Federation Council. And that's a sort of an honorary, you know, if you have that position, then you're on the Security Council. So she's there kind of by default. And how did she get to be the head of the Russian Federation Council, which is the upper house of the Russian parliament? Well, it helps to be a bit like Putin, I find, if you're a woman in Russia. So she's a bit like Putin in that she's of the same generation. She was born in 1949. She was born in Leningrad, grew up in Leningrad, which is also his hometown. She rose up through the Communist Party during Soviet times. She was a member of the Supreme Soviet, which was the parliament in Soviet times. But there she took a much more feminized route, and she was the head of the Supreme Soviet Committee on Women, Families, Maternity, and Childhood. And that has definitely been her focus in her subsequent politics. She became mayor of St. Petersburg, and from there she became part of the Federation Council and then was elected to head it. What was really noticeable about her contribution to the Security Council meeting in February of this year, she's the only one who seemed really comfortable actually with the whole idea of what was going down, which was interesting because the men were all very uncomfortable. But she really focused on the plight of women and children in the Donbass and how, you know, Russia needed to do everything it could to save those women and children. And she's also the only one who apologized for being emotional during her speech. So very much playing up to the feminized kind of gender stereotypes. Look at the Ministry of Defense. There is one woman deputy minister out of 12, and she's there as a legacy appointment. The previous defense minister, Anatoly Serdyukov, introduced a whole raft of military reforms, one of which was to bring in a number of his colleagues, his former colleagues from the tax police, where he was previously in charge. He was brought in as defense minister to deal with corruption. She signally failed to do, but never mind. And so for historic reasons, because banking and finance and accounting were regarded in Soviet times as women's work, low status, low priority. Soviet transfer of resources wasn't about banking. It was about political decisions, what to transfer. Banking was bookkeeping, and it was women's work. And so you have a lot of women in the finance sector in Russia these days. And so in the tax police, there were a lot of women. So Serdyukov brought with him a lot of women into the defense ministry. And I was at a conference back in 2010 in Washington, where one of Serdyukov's advisors tried to persuade me that this was because Serdyukov was gender aware and was in favor of gender equality. And I said, no, he's not. This is patronage. This is women rarely benefiting from political patronage. But anyway, she is what's left over from Serdyukov's appointments, and she's in charge of looking after the money in the Ministry of Defense. And she must be pretty good at her job to have held on for as long as she has. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, no women deputy ministers. Federal Security Service, no women deputy directors. Federal Intelligence Service, the SVR, well, their identities as deputies are secret, they're state secrets, but I'm gonna just make a wild guess and say probably they're not female dominated. And what's noticeable about all of these organizations is the extent to which the deputies, the sort of the next lower level down below the ministers, have risen up through the ranks of those institutions, doing the work, the core work of those institutions, right? So the other deputy ministers of defense, for example, are career military people who've risen up through the ranks and are now, you know, generals or whatever. The Federal Security Service, you know, they're all people with backgrounds in the intelligence services since the 1970s or 1980s. So these are structures which are really, you know, promoting their own. And clearly women are not people who are regarded as belonging, as sort of doing the core work, the natural work of those institutions. But why does this matter? Why is it important for understanding Russia's war in Ukraine and its implications for security? That there are so few women in leading roles in the institutions with the power and the responsibility to make Russia's security policy. So I'm not pointing this out because I want to make an argument about essentialist characteristics of women. I'm not saying that if only there were more women, then Russia would be peaceful, there would be no war, and rainbows and bunnies and all the rest of it. I'm saying that we know from the work of feminist scholars that when an institution or an area of human activity is overwhelmingly dominated either by men or by women, then it's not by chance, right? This isn't an accident. This isn't this is just a coincidence. Something's happening here, and something that should be really inviting us to look more closely and to try and understand what is going on and what work gender is doing and why. So in this case, we've sort of investigated, or I've briefly kind of explained to you how the few women who are there have got there. Because it's not an accident, really, that being a man and displaying certain kinds of masculinities is precisely what is really valued when it comes to Putin's Russia. So some of you might be familiar with Valerie Sperling's book, which I've got the cover there on the slide, which is called Sex, Politics, and Putin, Political Legitimacy in Russia, published in 2015. And this is the book where she argues that political actors in Russia, which includes opposition figures as well as Putin and elites who support him, make use of gender norms, ideas about masculinity and femininity, to gain authority and legitimacy. And that they do this because of the way that gender norms resonate with people. They resonate with society, they resonate with the elites. It's something that we all tap into without thinking about it. It's like breathing, it just feels natural, right? It's just there, lying around to be used, and so they use it. The year before Sperling's book was published, Oleg Ryabov and Tatiana Ryabova published an article in the journal Problems of Post-Communism titled The Remasculinization of Russia, Gender Nationalism and the Legitimation of Power under Vladimir Putin. And they argued that something quite similar to Sperling's argument that Russian authorities use the gender discourse of nationalism, which involves putting forward masculine images of Russia to create a positive collective identity of Russian society and the state. And that to a large extent, this remasculinization is a reaction against the 1990s, when Russians experienced their country and society as weak and ignored and taken for granted on the international stage. Now, Ryabov and Ryabova identify a Russian culture of strength because of the way that the notion of strength is held up as a virtue and a necessity for modern Russia, whether that strength is represented in the person of the leader, Putin, barebacked, horse riding, no shirt, all the rest of it, whether it's athletic achievement by the nation, if you think about the importance that Russia places on Olympic and other sporting events, hosting them as well as doing well in them, whether it's military might, whether it's economic power. So although both Sperling's book and Ryabova's article focus their analysis primarily on domestic politics, or entirely in the case of Sperling, the notion of remasculinization of Russia, I think, is a concept that extends really well to Russia's foreign and security policy, and to this war in particular. We can see the performance in the threats and the use of military force against Ukraine. This is in the buildup at the border in the preceding months, as well as in the invasion itself, as well as in Russia's heavy-handed use of espionage, active measures or covert operations, including things like assassination and attempted assassination. And they're done, these Moscow's use of covert operations, they're done in ways that invite us to understand that Russia is responsible, even while Russia denies that responsibility. This is something that Rory Cormack and Richard Aldrich have called implausible deniability. In other words, the actions that are taken are technically covert, and that the government says it wasn't us, nothing to do with us, but everybody knows that who is really responsible. So implausible deniability. It's a way of emphasizing that Russia is powerful. It's a way of emphasizing that Russia is willing to do whatever it takes to protect its interests, and that it's dangerous to oppose Russia. And this cultivation of a sense of danger and threat in foreign policy in Russia is something that Mark Galeotti has described as dark power, right? So it's this sort of brooding darkness, this threat that's there. So as Ryabov and Ryabova point out, the reverse side of remasculinization is demasculinizing others in political rhetoric. And we see this process at work in the way that Putin and other officials in Russia describe Ukraine and the Ukrainians in a feminized and even infantilized way. For example, as having no agency, no ability to be independent, and as being under the thumb of the United States. For example, Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, helped me out this week when he said, the West wants Ukraine to triumph over Russia on the battlefield and will not allow Ukraine to launch a peace process, forcing Kiev to accept Western weapons. And this is absolutely typical of the rhetoric which has come out of Moscow, not only in the past 5 months, but in the past 8 years, since the Maidan revolution in 2013, 2014. It's been an absolutely consistent theme for a while. And we can see Putin performing masculinity in his remarks at a joint press conference that he held with French President Macron on the 5th of February, 2022. And this was a press conference that was held after one of Macron's attempts at shuttle diplomacy, when he was trying to persuade Putin to back down, not take military option, look for diplomacy, what could happen, and so on. So they were talking about the Minsk II agreement, which was made back not long after the war in the Donbass began, which Russia wanted Kiev to implement fully, and which is actually quite a toxic agreement for Ukraine if you look at the details. And Putin made the statement, he said, "Like it or not, put up with it, my beauty. You have to follow the terms. There's no other way." All right, I'll repeat the phrase. "Like it or not, put up with it, my beauty. You have to follow the terms. There's no other way." Now, this comment was not in the official transcript that the Kremlin released, which suggested that it was not part of the scripted remarks. It was an offhand, off-the-cuff remark by Putin, which is, I think, very revealing. It didn't go through layers of scrutiny before he said it. What on earth does it mean? Well, it's a phrase that, particularly the "like it or not, put up with it, my beauty," is a phrase that had the Russian journalists in the room whispering with each other and kind of making shocked exclamations, and the foreign journalists saying, "What on earth did he just say? What does that mean?" So there are two meanings to this phrase, "like it or not, my beauty, put up with it." The innocent one is it's the kind of thing that parents in Russia say to their children, like, "Eat up your vegetables, do your homework, go to bed. Like it or not, my beauty, put up with it. You have to do it. Go on, do whatever it is." So at best, Putin is putting himself in the position of the parent and Zelensky is the child. It's infantilizing, it's patronizing. It's not a position of mutual respect for a fellow head of state, for sure. I mean, can you imagine Biden saying this to, I don't know, President Xi of China, for example? It's not the kind of diplomatic language that you would expect to hear from a president of a country. There is, however, a less innocent meaning associated with this phrase. And this is why the Russian journalists were shocked. The less innocent meaning is that it comes from a song, the lyrics of a song called Sleeping Beauty, which was recorded by a Russian punk rock group in the 1990s. And it refers to rape. Like it or not, put up with it, my beauty. Right? So Putin was, at best, being patronizing and infantilizing. At worst, he was being threatening, deeply misogynistic and very creepy, presenting himself and Russia as the powerful man in control, Zelensky and Ukraine as the helpless woman about to be violated. So I'll let you absorb that for a moment. It's pretty shocking. So having talked about where women are not, I'm going to turn on and focus my attention on where women are. So in relation to the war in Ukraine. So there's a couple of examples of women in sort of a middle layer, if you like. They're not making decisions about security, but they're in a position more of implementing and explaining. And so you have on the left-hand side of your screen, you have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova. You may recognize her if you pay any attention to kind of public statements by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia. She is always there with her skeptical look. This is her skeptical look. And she's very hawkish, very, very hawkish. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you may or may not recognize the chief person in charge of RT, Russia Today, the TV program, Margarita Simonian. And she frequently appears on Russian TV programs where, I don't know whether you're aware of this or not, but every night there's like a Russian news analysis program, which involves usually about 5 or 6 people, always one woman, usually Margarita, but sometimes it's another woman. And they're basically interpreting the news of the day for Russian audiences, and they're giving the Kremlin's line, but they're giving it a harder spin. And so everything that Putin says, they take it further. So again, very, very hawkish, really pushing the envelope, really emphasizing like the threat of nuclear war, for example. A lot of that comes from them, really, really harsh rhetoric. So it reminds us, looking at these two women, reminds me of Enlo's point that when a few women get let into a male-dominated space, they're very carefully chosen, and they're there to uphold the status quo, not to challenge it, right? So I don't know whether anybody recognizes this woman. She is the head of Russia's central bank, And she is probably the person who has done the most to protect Russia and Russian society from the absolutely disastrous war that Putin has launched, because it's her policies that have tried to stabilize the ruble, that have tried to prevent the economic sanctions from totally tanking the economy. And she's been remarkably successful, actually. And she famously has wanted to retire many times, and Putin won't let her because she's just too good at her job. And so it's interesting. She's definitely falls into the category of a technocrats. And there is this kind of layer of technocrats in Russian politics. Most of them have zero influence with Putin. They're basically people who are there to kind of do the work. But she seems to be in a rather different position. And again, she is there. She's from the banking and financial sector because it was women's work. Because it was devalued in the past, she's managed to rise to a very powerful position. So she's very, very smart. Let's move on from high-profile women to women more generally. On the 5th of March, Putin met with Aeroflot stewardesses when he visited the Aeroflot aviation school. And he had this meeting where they all had tea together on this big table, which was quite strange because normally Putin doesn't get that close to other people. Maybe he thinks women can't give him COVID, I don't know. But anyway, so we had this strange televised meeting, which was a carefully scripted Q&A session, where one after the other, the stewardesses said, "Oh, please, Mr. President, explain to us about the special military operation. We don't quite understand." And then the next question would be, something more about, tell us more about denazification in Ukraine and so on. So very carefully scripted, gave him the opportunity to explain everything to an audience. And it seems to me that, women are the people to whom Putin needs to explain things. They're sort of the stand-in for society. And if a stewardess can understand, look at these women, look at how empty-headed they must be, look at the way that they're dressed, look at all the makeup. If they can understand the war in Ukraine, well, anybody can understand it. So it's a bit of this sort of, who does he choose to explain it to? It's a bunch of women, really, really interesting. Also, women are important as symbols and supporters. There's been a whole ongoing effort to try and find a way of mobilizing society in support of this war. And the whole Z campaign has been a key part of it, the Z being one of the letters that's been painted on the Russian military vehicles as they enter Ukraine. Z campaign has kind of fallen flat, so they keep trying to reboot it and find new ways of presenting it to society. And poor old Babushka Z is one example. She's a Ukrainian granny who, seeing soldiers come into her village, thought that they were Russian soldiers, and she grabbed up a Soviet flag, which she happened to have lying around, and went outside to greet them, hoping that they would then treat her more kindly than they might otherwise have done. Turns out they were Ukrainian soldiers and so on. But Moscow thought this was fantastic, great PR. And so poor old Babushka Z is plastered on walls, on buildings, on billboards, everywhere. There's no real indication that she's resonating with the ordinary people, but this effort to find an ordinary woman, especially an older woman, a vulnerable sort of looking woman, to be the symbol of the war. And of course, organizing demonstrations in schools is another way that women, as predominantly school teachers rather than men, are supporting the war in various ways. Of course, what happens to them if they don't organize such demonstrations is not really to be contemplated. On International Women's Day this year, Putin made an address to women of Russia, as he often does on that day. And it's very interesting that in his address, he wasn't thanking women for their support of a special military operation. He was asking women to support it. And I think that's really significant, because I think it recognizes that not all women in Russia do support it, and that support is really necessary. Because one of the things that Cynthia Enlow has often reminded us of is the fact that men don't join militaries without any kind of reference to their family. It's family members who support that, particularly mothers. And if mothers withdraw that support, then that willingness to join might be compromised. It might be endangered. So in other words, there was a real recognition of this important dynamic. And soldiers' mothers in Russia in the past have been very important in withdrawing their support from Russia's military and from its military adventures in Afghanistan, in Chechnya, and so on. Now, at the moment, there's no evidence that Russia's mothers are rising up in mass to oppose the war, overthrow Putin, not that dramatic. But there are indications, certainly, of disquiet and concern, upset, worry about their sons serving in this war, upset at sons coming back dead and injured and so on. And this is one of the dynamics that I'm watching to see what kind of impact it makes, because Russia's already struggling with recruitment, having to recruit in prisons and this kind of thing. And, this is a factor which is contributing to the undermining of Russia's military. Right, we move on to Ukraine in the time that I've got left. So what work is gender doing in Ukraine's side of the war, shall we say? So in some respects, Ukrainian women have been very prominent and visible in this war. And in other respects, though, it seems like the main actors, especially the decision makers and the combatants, are men. There is an exception, which is about Ukraine's women soldiers that I'll speak to in just a moment. Zelensky's cabinet is undoubtedly dominated by men. There's one woman in the cabinet. He reshuffled last summer, I think. There were 6 women before, now there's just one for social work or social care, something like that. And when he goes out on these kind of impromptu walks around Kiev with his key policy members, they're always men. And this is one of his, selfies with, say, look, we're all staying in Kiev, we're all here with you. And this is really important, of course, for morale. Now, why is that interesting? Why is that important? Because the leadership at the national level being dominated by men gives a certain impression of who is working to protect and defend Ukraine. We don't see women at the lower levels where there are women, like mayors of cities or towns, or officials in regional areas who are working very hard to try and keep essential services going, to try and protect their citizens, try and rebuild as things get destroyed and so on. So we're not really seeing this lower level, which is where a lot of the work is happening. Instead, we're seeing an awful lot of Ukrainian military masculinity. And I would argue that military masculinity is essential to Ukraine to sell this war to the West. The West had to be persuaded that Ukraine was a good bet for supporting it with weapons, for supporting it with money, rather than just holding up their hands and saying, let Russia take it, as they did in Crimea in 2014. So the Ukrainians needed to demonstrate to the NATO countries that they could fight and that they would fight. And part of this was obviously, being competent in the field, which they proved to be. But I think part of it is also tapping into these things that resonate with people about what war is. And part of this is military masculinity. So you have the incident of the stamp, which is the Snake Island incident, when a Russian ship approached this little island in the Black Sea, just off the coast of Ukraine. And the Russian ship approached it and told the soldiers who were there to surrender. This is a Russian ship, we're ordering you to surrender. And one of the Ukrainian soldiers famously said, had a message for the Russian ship, which he's showing with a gesture of his finger there. And it became, of course, famous, and he became this hero. They thought he was dead originally, but then he just got turned up alive and has been given medals. But it is immortalized, this moment has been immortalized in a painting, which has turned into a stamp. And when they sold the stamps in Ukrainian post offices, the queues were out the door. They've reissued them multiple times. You can now buy them on eBay and other places. You can have your own. It's, but it's this defiance, this toughness, this resilience that's really being celebrated. The picture just above that is one of many, many from social media. There's loads of these little TikTok videos of Ukrainian soldiers in the field dancing with their weapons. There are so many of them. And again, it's this, almost joyousness of being involved in combat, this, this sense of this is what guys do. And yeah, you're really getting into it, and the defiance again, and so on against the Russians. And then the drawing there on the left-hand side, I don't know whether you're aware, but there's an organization of Ukrainian people, Ukrainian Canadians, who set up a website and a company called St. Javelin, and you can buy t-shirts, mugs, key rings, all kinds of things with Saint Javelin and other saints of Ukraine. Of course, she's holding this anti-tank weapon, which has been used extensively by the Ukrainian soldiers. And so they raise money for the Ukrainian military. So you can buy their merchandise and raise money and also donate extra things. And Saint Javelin has become very, very well known on social media. Zelensky was given a picture, was given a t-shirt with St. Javelin on it, and so on. So it's it's sort of this mirroring of art and life coming back and forth. So I think military masculinity is Ukraine's biggest. I mean, there are many framings of the war that Ukraine uses to try and gain support internationally and domestically, but I think military masculinity is a big one. At the same time, Ukrainian men are being framed very much as protectors and saviors of people who need help, like this pregnant woman being evacuated from a maternity hospital. But also the picture with the kitten is not an accident, because part of the framing of Ukrainian military masculinity is about a compassionate, it's a joy in, being at war, and a resilience and a toughness, but it's also this protectiveness and this compassion. And in part, they're using this way of framing their own soldiers as a contrast to the Russians, right? So Russians are mindless killing machines. They will torture, they will rape, they will loot, they will kill. Ukrainian soldiers will look after kittens. And indeed, animals has been a key part of this framing, because there are a lot of pictures and videos of Ukrainian soldiers saving, whether it's domestic pets that have been left behind, or farm animals, or zoo animals, or wild animals that have been injured in the war or killed in the war. So this whole dimension of humanizing the soldier. Okay, moving on to women. What are women doing in this war? They're supporters, and they actually do crucially important work in terms of collecting, raising money, gathering material, transporting it either to the front to support the war or to help displaced persons. I do a lot of this kind of work, which is crucially needed. They make things for the war. This is a group of women making camouflage nets to throw over Ukrainian weapons and equipment. Camouflage net making, as crowdfunding for the war, has been going on since 2014. It's a community bonding way, as well as actually giving practical support for the war. Ukrainian women as refugees, and this is maybe the biggest category that we see Ukrainian women falling into. You see them saying goodbye at the train station, and then this image of the woman with the home on her back, taking the home elsewhere. Really powerful, because the Ukrainian government made a decision quite early on in the war to close the borders to men of fighting age. So only women and men who are clearly not fit to fight are allowed to get out, and women are allowed to get out. So, the Ukrainian woman is refugee, but I think it tends to frame the woman as a victim very much. It tends to ignore the work that these women are doing, particularly women with children, which is quite a lot of them, in trying to preserve language and culture and identity of their families, so that they have something to go back to, so they still feel themselves connected to Ukraine, even though they're living in a foreign country, learning to speak a foreign language, and so on and so forth. And of course, you have the Ukrainian women as extraordinary soldiers. Now, this war has seen a very high proportion of Ukrainians combatants as women, as up to 20%, some people have argued. I'm not sure how accurate the records that they're keeping are, but certainly there's been a real upsurge in I would argue that they're not being depicted in quite the same ways as the men serving. We tend to see male soldiers doing things, whether it's chasing down Russian tanks to ambush them, or helping evacuate the victims of a bombing or something of that nature. Women tend to be in much more static poses, tend to be much more stereotyped. You get a lot of women getting married at the front. So it's, yes, they're there, but I'm not sure that they're really, their work is fully being kind of acknowledged or recognized. So one of the things that Ukraine did during the war in the Donbass was to really use women soldiers as a way of telling NATO, we share your values, we value gender equality. And so women soldiers were very prominent in the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense glossy publications produced in English, which are clearly aimed at a foreign audience. And it's not too surprising then that Ukraine signed up to the Women, Peace and Security agenda in 2016 and adopted a national action plan. Very unusual for a country at war to adopt a national action plan on WPS. WPS just briefly requires states that sign up to it to bring women into negotiations about peace and negotiations and discussions about post-conflict reconstruction, and to pay attention to their concerns and to incorporate their concerns into these processes. Well, so far that has not happened. Peace talks are not happening at the moment, but when they were happening, of course, they were an all-male event, and there's no evidence that I've seen that women have been feeding into these talks in a significant way. But I would actually go further than that, because in some ways, peace talks themselves are a bit of a performance, and maybe the Ukrainians feel if they had women sitting at the table that they would look weak to the Russians, which I think is very possibly the case. So what I want to do now to finish is really to point out to you that these kinds of discursive framings of who is doing the work of protecting and defending Ukraine and who isn't have a material consequence. And that is, let's talk about money. Ukrainian government has recently released, I think just last week, released a whole series of documents, several thousand pages. I haven't read all of them yet, but spending priorities for Ukraine's reconstruction. And I apologize, the size of the text and so on there is not easily visible to people in the audience. But basically, what they've done is they've identified key priority sectors for funding, which not surprisingly, I mean, is logical, but still, defense, metallurgy, machinery, agriculture, energy, IT, all male-dominated industries. They actually mention wildlife more often than they mention women in these documents. They talk a lot about sports, including the need to have facilities to train Olympic level athletes. They talk a lot about the importance of returning Ukrainians back to Ukraine, which is great. And you would think that that would mean that there's a priority on women's needs, but it's not actually. There's more code words there around attracting talent back. And they're talking about the wider diaspora, which existed before the current war. So I'm not saying that this is set in stone, but I am saying that it worries me that the way that women and men are being framed in the war in Ukraine suggests a certain set of priorities around who is to be congratulated, rewarded for protecting and defending the country, and who is regarded as those people who had to be protected and looked after. And I see a gendered split there, and I see the possibility and probability of very considerable material consequences arising from that. And I realize that I am running out of time, so I'm actually going to stop there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Right. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for those fascinating and really important insights into Russian perception. So we have a good 30 to 40 minutes for questions. Does anybody have a burning question with which to start with? If we could just remind you to please use the microphone in your small group so that people on Zoom can actually hear the questions as well. Are there two microphones, Isla? Should we be using one as well, or are we okay here? I think we're okay here. I think we're close enough there. Yeah.
Hi. Working. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and something I know nothing about. But I wanted to ask a question. You said that the masculinized war is a part of selling the war to the West. The sort of toughness, resilience, defiance, I think were the words you used. I wanted to ask, do you think that's actually counterproductive? Do you think we would see different responses? I remember that Ken said yesterday, the West is sort of not providing as much as he would maybe anticipate them. I might be misrepresenting what he said. But do you think it's actually counterproductive to sort of fall into those narratives in terms of trying to attract support? Well, on the basis that if you're already seen as tough, defiant, then you clearly don't need as much support. You clearly don't need, you only need weapons to replenish rather than personnel or other forms of support that might be more forthcoming if you're seen as being vulnerable, weak, basically the opposite of all of these things, not resilient.
So the type of support apart from training, and training doesn't happen in Ukraine. What they're getting is equipment and money, as well as diplomatic support. That's broadly speaking the package of what they're getting, and with the military support largely, some countries like Australia also provide equipment. The military support for Ukraine has been unprecedented. I think the speed as well as the scale has been
correctly. There may be other precedents that we can point to, but I think the speed and the scale together have been really amazing, considering it's only been, you know, a few months really, and the amount of weapons that certain kinds of weapons that they're not providing very soon. But I think after the experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq, where the Americans in particular provided weaponry and training, blah, 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 and they didn't feel that the Iraqi, unfairly, didn't feel that the Iraqis and the Afghans were up to it. They weren't really kind of fulfilling the expectations that the Americans had for them in particular. The Ukrainians felt that they needed to show that they could do the job. Give us the tools, we'll give the job. It's like that quote from Zelensky when in the early stages of the war, when Kiev was under attack, the American ambassador said, "Do you want us to evacuate you?" And he said, "I don't want to lift, I want ammunition." So, and that quote is now on the shirt side from Black Sabbath. So again, you know, tapping into this toughness, masculinity, you know, give me the tools, I'll do the job kind of thing. Whereas if the only framing had been, we are helpless, we are victims, it might have led to a different kind of response. And because there is that framing there too, about the women refugees and about, you know, the war crimes, about there's many different framings that are going on. But I would say that the military masculinity one is a really important one in keeping those weapons flows coming, keeping the West on side. And it's an appeal to society as well as government. I mean, these kinds of t-shirts and things, they're hugely popular. You know, St. Gallen's Day sold lots for Ukraine. So it's a big thing. And popular support in democracies is important for foreign policy. And so, you know, even though there's huge party political splits in the United States, and left and right, Republican, there is a remarkable degree of consensus about supporting. Not completely unified, but there is a lot of consensus. And it's partly because of the sense that they're the plucky fighters and they have right on the time doing the right thing.
I also want to, yeah, we are trying to promote on Twitter as well, as I know with your followers, and also Rahman CESRAN wanted to make sure that we are on Twitter for that event as well. Absolutely fascinating. I mean, both Esther coming from a different discipline as well. I know how, you know, just add woman and steer it in all other disciplines across the board that I am experiencing now. I think the question is more, you know, what do we mean by power? So, I mean, the things you were telling me made me to think about Mary Beard's book on woman and power, and how we are seeing going from Medusa to Merkel. We just need a new feminist roadmap to understand what we are thinking about different societies. Everything you say about Russia is exactly the same in Turkey. Patriarchy, masculine nationality, you know, what we say, Turkish nation is a male, erkek millet, male nation. It's all patriarchy all over academia, foreign policy, and we know Putin and Erdogan are just best, you know, brothers in arms, aren't they? So my question is actually more about if women aren't perceived or included in that to be within the structures of power, what we are seeing across the world in academia, in real world, in foreign policy, isn't it power that we need to reevaluate, rethink in international relations? I mean, in yesterday's sessions as well, with nuclear war, nothing is new, but something is the same. That military industrial complex just got even more complex. What we are seeing, what is happening with Ukraine, Russia, you know, Turkey is producing new drones now, helping. And all these questions just made me to think what we need to think is just how to include women in different things is all about power, and how we rethink about, we evaluate power, and, you know, and engage with that as women scholars and our IR scholars here as well, that the question is not actually just adding women and steering it, but rethinking what power is really means. I mean, we didn't pick up for instance, soft power was one of the big words and buzzwords, and all of a sudden it's not part of our debates anymore. What we are seeing with Russian invasion of Ukraine, as Ken said, back to these traditional ways of territorial borders. And with the pandemic, it's becoming more and more national everywhere, unfortunately, that our colleagues couldn't be here because they couldn't get visas. Thank you.
Yes, I would certainly agree that we need to rethink. I think I could really see it already happening and accelerating in the future. This refocus back on more traditional use of force, and already, countries in the West are saying, "Oh, we spend more on defense, we have to make more weapons, we have to make more ammunition. Oh, look at how our stocks are going down because of the war in Ukraine." And the defense contractors are probably rubbing their hands in glee. So, there's a lot of back to the future in this kind of way of thinking about things. But I think we need to be aware, we need to kind of zoom out of the focus, the micro focus on what's happening on the battlefield and how many weapons and so on, and think about some of the bigger and wider ramifications of this war and what continuation of this war for an indefinite period, which can happen, could cause. And thinking about, for example, food shortages, energy price rises, these kinds of things. Food in particular, has got this huge impact on the whole world, and particularly on parts of the world which are, very reliant upon the importing of food for various reasons, and those import chains are being badly disrupted and disrupted for some time. So I think we need to think about other forms of power in addition to military power. We need to be alert to, I think, I said yesterday about the destructive dimension, the destructive character of this war on Russia as well as on other places, and really focus much more on these other dimensions of power and these other dimensions of impact on ordinary people and on other parts of the world. So although I was focusing on Russia and Ukraine, there's a lot of feminist analysis to be done of what's happened with the impact on the global South, and yeah, there's an awful lot going on here. We need to perhaps not be exclusively focused, perhaps I should say, on the military side, put it in its place, but also be looking at other ways of power work.
Thanks, Jenny. I've got 4 quick points, if I may. One is when you spoke about Putin and the entire masculinity posture. I wonder whether that actually has got to do, well, partly with what the society is like and imagines itself. But it's probably also quite, and you know this all well, but I would like you to elaborate on this. It's got to do with the crisis of masculinity in Russia. I mean, the life expectancy for men is significantly lower than for women. Alcoholism is rampant, suicide rates and all that. So I wonder whether this posture is an attempt to actually give men some hope. It's a hopeless society. And I mean, Isla's laughing, but it seems to me, Masha Gessen has this brilliant article a few years back on why the Russians have been dying out. And the main thesis of her piece, of course, is that they have been dying out of hopelessness. So there might be a slightly different take on that. The second point is, when you started talking about women in the national security apparatus, and this is not meant as an unkind comment, but I was wondering actually whether you're falling into the traditional security trap. In other words, you divided the institutions of hard security and then everything else. And when you started talking about it, I noted down Elvira Napolina's name too, and then you obviously mentioned her as the head of the Russian Central Bank. But exactly as you said, I mean, her efforts have done probably more for Russia's security than anybody else. And therefore, it would seem to me that the division might actually be A, unhelpful, and B, is not quite in line with where you would position yourself in terms of security studies. So maybe not falling into the traditional, non-traditional divide might be to your advantage. The PowerPoint that Ayla mentioned, well, it seems to me that there actually is a lot of talk about hard power and all that. But of course, there has been a lot of talk about soft power in a different sense. Just think about how much soft power and other forms of power have countries in the Baltics, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, garnered as a result of hosting millions of refugees from Ukraine. They are listened to largely because of how much they have absorbed, as well as because of how much they have supported Ukraine. Yeah, so that's, I mean, it seems to me that there are various forms of power in play, including soft power. The final point was, you put out a very tantalizing argument that Ukrainian military masculinity has been put out there to convince the West that Ukraine is a good bat. And I think it's an extremely interesting idea. I do wonder what's the evidence, and I realize there are all sorts of limits, but what would be the evidence to support this? I'm slightly hesitant to accept that, largely because you can see all sorts of pictures, and there's plenty of pictures of women in dynamic fighting. So, I mean, as you know all too well, in dynamic fighting positions, if one wishes to see those. It's not just men, but I wonder, because it says perhaps more about the West than it says about Ukraine, actually. And so I would be curious to see what leads you, what evidence leads you to put out that argument, or whether you're searching systematically for that evidence. But yeah, a great talk. Thank you very much.
So I am searching systematically for that evidence, but I don't have it all lined up yet. But a lot of official Ukrainian accounts, like social media accounts, so whether it's the president, the Minister of Defense, whether it's other senior advisors, or other accounts that are associated with the Ukrainian government in some form, are definitely putting out these kinds of evidence. So I can say that with confidence. I'm not necessarily sure how precisely self-confident, self-conscious it is, in the sense that, in a bit like the remasculinization of Russia, I think this is something which is being tapped into possibly almost instinctively. We need to show that we are, a good bear, but these are the kinds of things that, these are kinds of images and ideas that tend to feed that kind of an argument. So I think there's a certain amount of intentionality and maybe a certain amount of instinct that's going into this, because gender is one of those things which is, I call it patriarchy's stealth weapon. It's something that, lulls us into the sense that everything is what we see. That's a really good reminder to me to step up my efforts to more systematically look, so that I can say confidently or withdraw that comment that there is this, this push of this particular. Yeah, it needs a bit more kind of evidencing to be able to say, yeah, this is definitely what's happening. But my instinct for having consumed a lot of material is that is. There was one about Russian masculinity in crisis, basically. And I think you're right. I think this is part of what is going on. If you think about the 90s, not only was the Russian economy in trouble, Russia was pretty much disregarded on the international stage. It was assumed that Russia would go along with the West in doing various things when it didn't always want to. Of course, at the helm was Boris Yeltsin, who was ill. He was at the helm was Boris Yeltsin, who was ill and getting more unwell and elderly and increasingly out of touch. And so you had this picture of a society
in crisis, an economy in crisis, a state in crisis, and a leader who was, falling apart in front of their eyes. Bring in Putin, and what do you have? You have a relatively young man. He was only in his 50s when he first became president. He, does judo. He does all this active action man stuff, and he turns around the economy, which, thanks to global oil prices going up dramatically at the start of his first presidency, Russia's economy bounced back and lots of good things happened. So yes, there is this more general kind of association and need to associate strong man, strong leader, strong country, strong economy at a time when, a lot of Russian men are not particularly strong, are, as you say, life expectancy and all the rest of it. So in many ways, it's more important to assert these things when they're not actually true on the ground, more important to make that kind of statement. So I would definitely agree with you there. Let me see, what were your other 2 points? Sorry. Right, got it. Yep. Okay. Because I was concentrating initially on the institutions and the people who surround Putin in relation to decisions on this war. And so that is where from what we can gather, those were the kind of institutions, and the heads of them are the kinds of people that Putin has been consulting with: Minister of Defense, the FSB, SVR, and so on. And he consults with the Security Council and so on. So this is why I was focusing on those people. Yeah, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Finance, heads of the different regions of Russia, those are also on the Security Council. And actually there are dimensions of this war where they are crucial. If you think about dealing with protest in Russia, Ministry of Justice is right up there, prosecuting, throwing people in prison, all the rest of it. You think about where the million or more, I think it's 2 million now, Ukrainians who've basically been kidnapped and taken to Russia are being dispersed around the country. So the people who are in charge of the federal regions are quite important in knowing what's happening with them and controlling what happens to them. Ministry of Finance, very important in terms of what's happening with the economy and sanctions and so on. But because I was really focusing on kind of key decision-making around the start of the war and the prosecution of the war, that's where I put my focus. But you're quite right. And I completely agree that we need to look at security more broadly. And this is obviously a feminist approach as well. You need to look at security more broadly. But I think I really wanted to make the point that at this sort of hard end of decisions about this war, there are probably no women who meaningfully fed into this decision. And I think that's something that we just need to acknowledge.
Thank you, Jenny, for a very interesting, fascinating presentation. I wanted to ask you if you could say a little bit more about the presence of women in Russia generally. You talked, rightly so, about those at very senior, state political decision-making levels. But I'm quite interested because you did mention, of course, and we saw it on TV footage in the early days of the war, that the protests in Moscow and many other cities, actually women were very prominent, it seemed to me, in those scenes of demonstrations. And we know the consequences for those of immediate arrest, and subsequently they could be imprisoned for 12 years is very demotivating, to say the least, and frightening. But I'm wondering, from your very diverse sources of information, do you see any trends of feminist consciousness, women challenging probably at the lower levels of society? And it could be within local groups or perhaps amongst women academics. So I'd quite like to hear a little bit about that, please.
Yeah. Okay, great question. Yeah, so this is actually the subject of a project that I'm working on with a Russian academic who's based in Aberdeen. And she and I are very interested in the gendered societal responses to the war, in particular, the complicated kind of nuanced responses, because there are women who absolutely support the war. There was a famous intercepted telephone conversation that happened a few months ago between a Russian soldier in Ukraine and his wife back in Russia, which people may or may not have been aware of, where the Russian soldier says to his wife something like, oh, I'm in Ukraine and I'm going to rape all these Ukrainian women because they deserve it. And she basically said, yeah, you're right, go for it, they deserve it, just use a condom. So you have this kind of extreme end, right, of support for the war. But you also have very serious opposition. And there are feminist groups, Russian feminist groups, there's a Russian feminist sort of alliance that are actively supporting the war. They have been kind of out on the streets as it has become more dangerous to do that, more risky to do that. Then they've been using other methods to try and demonstrate protest, handing out little bits of paper to people as they pass in the street, or putting little notes in shops and things. But even there, some people have been prosecuted for leaving notes in shops. I mean, you can be prosecuted for standing and holding, not only holding a sign that says no to war, you can be prosecuted for standing and holding a blank piece of paper, or for holding up one of Putin's quotes from years gone by where he talks against war, or indeed for standing and holding your hands as though you're holding a piece of paper, but you're not really holding anything. So basically there is no toleration whatsoever in this regime for any, at this moment, for any point, any kind of opposition that's publicly expressed. And the picture I showed you of the school and the little children in the Z and carrying the flags, there have been instances where school teachers have gone off message and have raised doubts in their lessons about the war and have been ratted out by their pupils and have been prosecuted. Teachers have been fired and arrested and so on as a result of that. And as part of another project I'm working on with somebody else, we're looking at the securitization of history and the militarization of youth. And this is, I think, one of the most sinister aspects of what's happening, apart from all the death and destruction of Ukraine, which is the most sinister, so maybe the second most sinister, is the way the regime is targeting young people and children, and even the very little one, but up through teenage years, because they know they've lost a generation in their 20s and early 30s. Those people do not support the war. And this is one of the reasons they're having such a hard time continuing to staff the war. But the young ones, the kids, they're there to be molded, and the messages that are going out through the schools are really kind of horrifying in terms of what they're telling the kids. So yeah, there is feminist resistance, but it's quite marginalized because feminism in Russia has got a really bad name. People associate it with the Soviet times when women were told you're equal, and that means you have to do all the work in the at your work, and then you have to go home and do all the childcare and all the laundry and queue for vegetables and everything. So feminism does not have a good name in Russia, but younger feminists are organizing against the war and doing what they can. But it's very difficult because of the harsh position that the regime has taken. It's difficult because of the last 10 years, the regime has really cracked down on independent media, on civil society organizations. They've introduced these foreign agent legislation, which makes it really difficult to operate if you're deemed a foreign agent. A lot of Russians who oppose the war have left Russia. So it's a really complicated and difficult situation for Russians to oppose it. Some do, nevertheless. I'm aware of some academics who are open in their opposition. And there's one in particular who follows me on Twitter. He always likes my cat pictures. I post pictures of my cats. And for about a week during the war, he wasn't liking my cat pictures. So I got worried about him. So I messaged him and said, "Are you okay?" He said, yeah, I'm fine. But I noticed ever since then, he's very quick to like the cat pictures. So it's like a code to say, I'm still all right, I'm not in prison. So there are Russians who are opposing the war, including feminists, but it's a minority, I have to say.
Thanks, Jenny, that was great. The question, where are the women, is always the best place to start. And towards the end, you were talking about where are the women in Ukraine, and you talked about them as supporters and ammunition makers and so on and so forth. And it started making me think about women's bodies, and why haven't you talked about women who were fighting in the front line? This goes back to Jan's fourth point, because you don't have to look very far to see women snipers, for example, in Ukraine. And I was wondering about a category, that is, where are the women? Where are women soldier casualties? We don't see any. And in Western militaries, one of the standard arguments about letting the women go very far in the military, that is into the front lines, has been this thing that soldiers and sailors can't stand the idea of having their female colleagues blown up in front of them and having to deal with their bodies and so on. You know, why didn't you talk about, it's Jan's question really, but why didn't you talk about the women soldiers? And is there the same sort of inhibition within the Ukrainian military that is in Western militaries? That is, we're sort of okay to have, you know, women radar operators and so on and so on, but we don't want them in the front line because we might have to deal with their mangled bodies.
Okay, great question, thanks. And that reminds me of Jan's other point that I didn't address, so that was useful. So I guess my take on women soldiers in Ukraine is informed in part by my knowledge of how difficult they're finding it to be accepted as fighters, because the Ukrainians are really good at presenting a united front. I think this is true for Ukrainian government, it's true for Ukrainian society, it's true for the diaspora. And it's really hard to pick underneath that united front and to see some of the tensions and some of the issues that are arising. But I am in contact with some Ukrainian feminist sociologists who've done work on and with women soldiers. And what they're telling me is that even though Ukrainian military desperately needs the women, and yes, they are fighting on the front lines, yes, they are doing more than what I showed you, there is the women in Ukrainian military are facing exactly the same kinds of challenges and barriers that women face when they join state militaries more generally. And the same kinds of issues come up again and again in terms of don't really belong, as well as the kind of the issue of protectiveness and wanting to look after them and so on. So I think women are in the front lines. They are doing important work. I honestly don't think it is as widely recognized. I don't think the recognition, public recognition, doesn't reflect the extent of what they're doing. I think there's definitely a lag, and there's definitely a tendency to put forward these more kind of stereotypical, more feminized images of them, more static images. In terms of women casualties, again, the Ukrainians have been very careful in controlling information about casualties on their side. And at certain times, there's been zero information about military casualties. And at other times, they've released figures and they've talked about casualties more openly. And it's quite strategic in the way that they do this. And I think it is related to trying to judge when they need to hold back and when they need to be more forthcoming in relation to their relationship with Western suppliers of money and weapons and so on, whether they need to emphasize that they're losing lots of forces, so they need more support, or they want to demonstrate that they're doing really well, and so they keep quiet about the casualties. I have seen acknowledgements of women soldiers' casualties on social media. So the same kinds of accounts that I follow that present all the other pictures do occasionally will present an in memoriam picture of a woman soldier. And I've seen those on numerous occasions. Very often they're medics, actually, the ones that I have seen, but you know, serving a variety of purposes. So I don't have actual figures. I'm not sure whether they've released any official figures in terms of breakdowns of men and women killed, but I do see some of these kinds of memorials.
Okay, thank you. It's on, yeah. We have a question from CESRAN colleague Rahman, and he wants you to comment on Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister, comment on if Putin was a woman, there would be no war in Ukraine.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, it's like, okay. I remember rolling my eyes at that one a bit when it came out. So at one level, there's a recognition that masculinity is playing a role here in this war and in the way that Putin presents himself and the way that he regards issues of security and war and so on. On the other hand, of course, Boris was doing what Boris does, which is making a populist kind of a statement about something which sounds good, but actually people who know about it understand that it's not the whole picture. So it's, again, buying into this essentialist understanding of women as peaceful, and as you know, not being inclined to war and so on. And whereas, you know, feminist scholarship tells us that these attitudes are socially constructed, they're not innate within us. It's not about biology, it's about how we're trained, and the women who rise up to these kinds of powerful positions often are socialized, usually are socialized in the process. So they become part of a system rather than necessarily opposing the system. So I would disagree. I would agree with Boris that gender is playing an important role here, and so is masculinity. I would disagree with Boris in thinking that it's all down to, you know, if Putin only wore a wig, then we'd be fine. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm wondering about the role of religion too, because we're seeing a rise of Christian nationalism in various parts of the world. And so Putin has been aligning himself with the Russian Orthodox Church. And I wonder if this goes back to the question of masculinity, and it's part of reaffirming a kind of muscular Christianity, but that also then tells women their role is in the home reproducing. And I wonder if as a post-war narrative, if there's going to be much more emphasis on women repopulating the country, perhaps for Ukraine as well as for Russia. And you know, we've seen Viktor Orban telling women to have more children in Hungary, similar things happening in America and elsewhere. I just wondered if that was something you'd looked at all.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yes, I would say there's a lot of that going on. So the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state have been like that. The Russian Orthodox priests regularly go and they bless the troops, they bless the weapons that are going out to Ukraine, you know, they sprinkle holy water on them and so on. So there's a real tight connection. The church is absolutely in support of this war, no question about it, and absolutely a force for social conservatism. Several years ago, you may remember Pussy Riot were arrested for performing a protest in a Russian Orthodox church. And the protest that they were performing was in protest against the Russian Orthodox Church's strong support of Putin, and the fact that priests were telling their congregations to vote for Putin, in church services. So this was kind of what was at the root of this. So yes, there's a long-standing, certainly throughout post-Soviet Russia, the resurgence of the Orthodox Church and its close connection with politics has been a really interesting dimension. And there's definitely that social conservative side of it too. And yes, occasionally Russian Orthodox officials say crazy things about women, very backward things about women. And I would not at all be surprised to see this sort of pronatalism kind of coming back well, I mean, it's already there in the sense that Putin reignited or reestablished the motherhood medal, which I think the Soviets used to give out. I think you have to have 12 children to get the motherhood medal, something like that. 12 children under 18, something like that. But it's ridiculous. But it's of a piece with other kinds of things. And this is another thing which I wonder about in terms of post-war Ukraine. When I say who is going to be remembered for being, defending, for having to be defended, what is going to be the impact on money, but on social values as well. And when I say this to Ukrainian feminists, they tell me I'm being too pessimistic, that the war is a watershed and that Ukrainian women's participation will be remembered and it will mark a real change and a real blow for gender equality. And I hope that they're right, but I fear that they may not be, because this is the pattern in wartime. Normal rules are relaxed and gender norms get relaxed so that women can do all the things that the state needs them to do. When the war finishes, women are generally told, go back home, have babies, get married, look after the kids, leave the jobs to the men, and any kind of post-war more gender equality usually comes quite slowly and quite gradually.
There are actually a lot of very, very good and capable women who are doing day-to-day very, very high-level executive stuff, and I don't think these women are going anywhere. And they preceded, their presence precedes the conflict. So I think they do have grounds to be fairly optimistic.
Good. I hope you're right, and they're right. Yes. Final question.
Thanks, Jenny. That was terrific. Can I just try and at the end here, just widen us out a little bit and just take you sort of into a wider sort of context of feminist security studies and thinking about the Boris comment on Putin. I mean, obviously, we know there've been lots of female leaders, Thatcher, Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi, and so on, all of whom have exhibited these masculinized qualities of strength and the need to show, that they're not soft, and that they can stand up to their and there's lots of interesting work coming out, as you know, on male-female dyads. And I'm actually working on one of those at the moment, which is the Benazir Bhutto Rajiv Gandhi one, for a book I'm writing with Marcus Holmes. And what's really interesting about that dyad is that they don't seem to have revealed the need to better one another. So Gandhi didn't feel like he had to, unlike his mother, arguably, didn't feel that he had to be that way. And she also, didn't feel that because she was a woman leader, she had to exhibit that. And I think also we saw that with Thatcher and Gorbachev. That's another case we're doing. And again, so we have these sort of male-female dyads which don't seem to respond to what, the Iron Lady kind of construction of masculinity that we saw with, for example, with Thatcher. And that got me thinking, as you were talking about sort of, what does it mean then to show strength in leadership? And I was thinking about Jacinda Ardern. A lot of people, I mean, Claire York's doing some really interesting work in this space. A lot of people sort of would argue that she shows a strength in leadership, but it's clearly coming from a feminized conception of security, not a masculinized one. So the things that we associate with military masculinity, the things that we associate with that kind of hyper-masculinized approach to security, is there a way of kind of reconstructing those very ideas so that they get expressed then very differently? So that then, in a sense, what it means to be strong is something different in leadership. And I just wondered whether you sort of had any reflections on that in the light of your research. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think quite a lot of whether or not a woman leader conforms to that masculinized stereotype of the Thatcher kind of person or not, or more like an Ardern. I think a lot of that has to do with the domestic political stereotypes and norms and so on of her own society and politics. So I would start with that. But I would also say, yeah, definitely one of the really interesting things about COVID is the question about whether having a woman leader has made a difference to different countries. And I think the evidence is quite mixed, because I was looking into that a little bit, and the evidence is quite mixed, unfortunately. I would love to be able to say, yeah, having a woman leader makes all the difference, makes the country stronger and safer and everything. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But I think you're quite right. And it's good that Ardern is there as a role model of a different kind of leadership. And the hope is that by actually seeing somebody doing it makes a difference. We're not always just seeing this masculinized version of what a leader is, what a leader is. We can also see other ways of performing those characteristics and more positive and constructive ways of performing those characteristics for the societies themselves. Because we see societies as becoming more healthy and prosperous and so on, in Russian society, which I think then maybe people will be able to draw certain conclusions. But I think it takes quite a long time for these things to change. The more disheartening aspects of studying gender is the persistence of some of these norms, the difficulty of shifting them. But on a more optimistic note, we can say thanks to Nick for pointing us to these more positive examples and the hope that people more leaders.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for your insightful talk and very much response to questions and we will stop now for a coffee break so you can recaffeinate before moving on to your next session. Thank you again for that.